Welcome everybody, you're watching Yesteryear, and today these are the horror movies that we loved of 1932. 1932 was a great year for movies. Let's go ahead and check out what's in store for the horror movies of 1932. First up we have is Shandu, action, adventure, comedy, and horror. When delusional madman Roxor kidnaps a scientist in hopes of using his death ray to achieve world dominance, he is opposed by Shandu, a powerful hypnotist and yogi. Shandu is a great horror film of 1932. Next up we have is Haunted Gold. John and Janet get a weird letter telling them to go to a ghost town which has an abandoned mine. This is a drama, mystery, western, and horror film. Not bad for 1932, featuring the legendary John Wayne. Haunted Gold. Next up we have is White Zombie, also released in 1932, straight out horror. A young man turns to a witch doctor to lure the woman he loves away from her fiancé, but instead turns her into zombie slaves. White Zombie. This is a great movie. Kind of funny, but it's a good movie. Next up we have is The Horror. Oh, you hear that?
The horror.
A young woman in a creepy old house is terrorized by a killer and an ape-like monster. This is a drama and horror, released also in 1932. Check out The Horror if you want to get scared. Next up we have is The Mummy. 1932 is a great movie for classics, fantasy and horror. A resurrected Egyptian mummy searches Cairo for the girl he believes to be his long lost princess, Hamunaptra. So there we got The Mummy, Boris Karloff. Next up we have is The Old Dark House, also released in 1932. Seeking shelter from a storm, 5 travelers are in for a bizarre and terrifying night when they stumble upon the Femme family estate. The Old Dark House, adventure, comedy, drama, and horror. Next up we have is The 13th Guest, also released in 1932, drama, music, mystery, and horror. 13 years ago, somebody murdered the wealthy host of a dinner party. Now the guests one by one reunite to find the killer, but soon they're all being killed themselves. Next up we have is The Hound of the Baskervilles. This one also was released in 1932, crime, mystery, and horror. When a nobleman is threatened by a family curse on his newly inherited estate, Sherlock Holmes is hired to investigate. The Hound of the Baskervilles and Sherlock Holmes was very popular in the 30s and 40s. Next up we have is Behind the Mask. An undercover federal officer serving time in prison fakes his escape in order to infiltrate a heroin smuggling ring. Crime, horror, and mystery. Behind the Mask. Check it out. Next up we have is Dr. X, or Dr. 10. Comedy, crime, and horror. A wisecracking New York reporter intrudes on a research scientist's quest to unmask the Moon Killer. Dr. X. This has a lot of good little jump scares for its time. Released in 1932. Coming up next is Freaks, drama and horror. A circus's beautiful trapeze artist agrees to marry the leader of a sideshow performer, but his deformed friends discover she is only marrying him for his inheritance. Next up we have is Get That Girl, action, adventure, crime, and horror. A young girl who is about to receive a large inheritance is abducted to an isolated sanitarium where a crazed doctor is performing strange experiments. Check out Get That Girl, another great film. Next up we have is Island of Lost Souls. Also released in 1932, a film noir, horror, and sci-fi film A mad doctor conducts ghastly genetic experiments on a remote island in the South Seas, much to the fear and disgust of a shipwrecked sailor who tries to kill him. Island of Lost Souls. Next up we have is Congo. This remake of West of Zanzibar 1928, made 4 years later, tries to outdo the Lon Chaney original in morbidity. Congo is a drama and horror. Check out Congo. Next up, we have a classic, The Mask of Fumanchu. Englishmen race to find the tomb of Genghis Khan before the sinister Fu Manchu does. The Mask of Fumanchu, adventure, horror, and sci-fi. This movie is good, pretty good for its time. Remember, this is 1932, but these are scary horror movies. Next up we have is Strangers of the Evening. Comedy, crime, mystery, and horror. Bodies start mysteriously disappearing from the city morgue. An investigator tries to determine what is going on. What is going on? Strangers of the Evening, 1932 release. Next up we have is The Most Dangerous Game. Action, adventure, and horror. A psychotic big game hunter deliberately strands a luxury yacht on a remote island where he begins to hunt passengers for sport. The Most Dangerous Game. This is a thriller, but it's a scorcher. Next up we have is Secret of the Blue Room. Crime, drama, and horror. 20 years after 3 murders occur in a castle blue room, 3 men who each want to marry a beautiful girl decide to spend a night in the room to prove their bravery to her. Secret of the Blue Room, I highly recommend it. Next up we have is The Monster Walks.
The Monster Walks.
People in an old dark house on a stormy night are menaced by a killer ape. This is a horror and mystery. The Monster Walks. Remember, this is before King Kong, but this is pretty good. The Monster Walks. Next up we have is The Living Dead. Comedy, sci-fi, and horror of its time. A crazed scientist murders his wife, walls her up, then flees. A reporter sets out to track him down. The Living Dead. Comedy and horror. Next up we have is Vampire. A drifter obsessed with the supernatural stumbles upon an inn where a severely ill adolescent girl is slowly becoming a vampire. Vampire. Fantasy and horror. So what do you think? Those were the horror films that we loved of 1932. You had vampires, you had zombies, you had killer apes. So 1930s is already becoming a good year or a good decade so far. 1930, 31, 32 were horror films. People loved to be scared back then. And back then, these were the best films, the only horror films of their time that were basically drawing in the box office. What do you think about the horror films that we loved of 1932? Let me know your thoughts. I'm Tony, you're watching Yesteryear today. Thank you for joining me. If you haven't already, click subscribe, hit that notification bell, and I'll see you all in the next video.